Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this four-part series, which is brought to you with generous support from the Wilfrid Laurier University Press, we're going to be talking about how the arts and the creation of art can support, advocate for, and advance environmental justice and sustainability. Joining me are Alicia French, professor of the history of art and visual culture in the Department of Visual Arts at Brock University, and Amanda White, an artist, scholar, and SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Sustainable Curating in the Department of Visual Art at Western University. Together, Alicia and Amanda have co-edited the volume Ecologies in Practice, Environmentally Engaged Arts in Canada, a collection of essays, artwork, poetry, and descriptions of community projects that reveal how art can contribute and extend the scholarship around environmental concerns. It's a book that establishes a central role for the creative arts and the interdisciplinary approach of the environmental humanities. In this third episode of our series, we continue our conversation about Alicia and Amanda's book and highlight specific chapters that illuminate some of its main themes. We also discuss how art, in its creation and messaging, fits in with the broader, larger scale communication and research around environmentalism and sustainability. So speaking of the local, in the first chapter, in the first section, Interrupt, Camille Georgian Usher uses a small city garden as a really excellent symbol of the power of gathering and an inspiration for a contemporary art event that she curated. That gathering dynamic of creating and enjoying a garden was reflected then in the artistic event itself, opening up new ways of thinking about or interrupting, so to speak, how humans interact with their environments. So this chapter seemed really, well suited to carry forward the themes of the book. Is that a fair statement, or can you, if so, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I would agree, and I appreciate those reflections on that piece. And perhaps part of the reason why, of course, it's sort of at the forefront of the book. Sort of coming after the introduction there. But yes, absolutely, a really sort of rich piece that's reflecting on just what we're sort of talking about prior, these colonial capitalist histories and legacies of those practices and continuing practices that are so inherently woven into land and conversations around land, but also sort of thinking about gathering as intervention and sort of thinking as gathering as that sort of action, right? And here I would say gathering inclusive of multi-species sort of interactions, which I think was really lovely and important. So there's that component of the piece, but also she does this really nice job of thinking about the role of the curator in these conversations, that role of the artist in these conversations, again, perhaps unsettling expectations in some ways, thinking about artist curator as facilitator, as organizer, as storyteller, as community builder, spaces that are imagining alternatives to past, present, future. So I think it's a really sort of excellent piece in sort of situating our framework and the conversations that follow. Amanda, I don't know if you had additional sort of reflections on that as well.
Yeah, I think also the opening, to open the book with Camille's sort of generous invitation to think otherwise with her was so beautiful. And we really kind of, as the editors, felt we wanted to sort of bring, really foreground that. And so her pieces at the beginning, sort of to enter the conversation, but also we wove her that question and that invitation into some of our conclusion and that kind of thing. Because also we're so honored to work with all of these artists and writers and learn so much from them for their practices and yeah, it was a really just hopeful. I feel like a lot of the
Mhm.
conversations around environment as well can be like overwhelming with sort of grief and fear, and to have this like hopeful, generous like invitation to work together is so important to what we were trying
Mhm.
to do with the book. So her piece was such a
Mhm.
important part of that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
In opening those dialogues. Yeah.
right, right. Excellent. So, similarly, in the final chapter, in the witness section called "Carbon Study: Walking in the Dark," Genevieve Robertson contrasts what biological artists typically do, which is reproducing or recording findings in nature, with what she now feels needs to happen, um, which is that we need to call attention to ecological loss, as she puts it. Can you talk about her artistic technique for doing so?
Sure. I'll start, I guess, Alicia, and then if you have anything to add. But what I really love about Genevieve's contribution to the book is the way her work kind of folds time together, and
Mm,
I think that's what we were really excited about. Um, Conceptually finding work that does that, because I think art in general is a tool for doing that. And with these large global sort of massive geological scale issues that we're facing, it's really hard to see things, and art can be this tool to kind of visualize the invisible, as Alicia mentioned earlier. But Genevieve's work really kind of exemplifies that, I feel, because she's using the charred remains from forest fires to depict these ancient organisms in the places they're from. And so it's really like folding time in this beautiful way and speaking to like the long history of life, but also to like current destruction of, or not destruction, but the current issues with fire. And I say I held myself back because then we have another contributor who talks about the importance of fire, and of that it's not always this terrible thing, and that fire is also like an important ecological like maintenance. So
mhm,
anyways, I'm walking myself back from
Mhm.
calling fire terrible, but uh you know back to Genevieve's work, it just does that in this beautiful way. So they're visually
Mhm.
stunning pieces, and we were so happy that she allowed us to use one for the cover of the
yeah.
book. But they also speak to that geological time, and in this way that I think will allow people to think differently about it. Yeah.
Mhm,
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's really lovely. I think too, just one other sort of observation. I liked this idea of, thinking about technique, and she talks a bit about material explorations, right? Which I think is an important part, right? So thinking about pigments that she's creating through, geologic and sort of organic matter. But the technique that you're sort of asking about too, thinking about that act, right, of collecting, and she talks about it, she's processing it, and grinding organic matter, often carbon materials, so coal, for instance. But she's ultimately like excavating, right, in some ways. So she's mirroring in some ways some of those extractive industrial uses that reflect larger scale loss in a contemporary sense, but that material is made up of living and once living beings. So that's that layer of sort of folding time that Amanda's talking about, that's just so remarkable. But she does this really excellent sort of or has this excellent moment where she holds herself accountable, or implicates her in that process, right, of
mhm.
using those materials, and drawing with that material. That I think goes back to what we were just talking about earlier, in terms of thinking about action and reflection, personal reflection, and how that also contributes to larger systems at play as well.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so I really liked that chapter, and it was being able to read that and then see examples and images of her work was kind of a mind-blowing experience. I mean, just I and then what that ended up doing was having me think about if I had just seen the image of her art without having read that chapter, would I have been able to interpret it that deeply, and so which made me think, like environmentalism and sustainability often benefit from, really large scale communication that hopefully everyone can understand and, to sort of inspire action. I mean, do you ever worry that the arts not necessarily are overcomplicating the messages, but that the messages might be obscured in an image that to a regular person, so to speak, may not be able to understand, deeply enough what that art is trying to get across? Well, whoever wants to answer that first can go.
Sure, I can start. So I think it's an interesting question because art could overcomplicate, but I think there's also this, in general, when we're talking about environmental issues, there's like the sort of the primary sources, like the scientific information is very like impenetrable to
Good point. Yes.
to the
Yeah.
general public, but
Mhm.
then the communication of that to the general public is almost like too simplified to the point where it's like, here's the problem, here's what you got to do, where it doesn't leave room for people to really think deeply. I don't think. And I mean, I'm not saying, oh, I have a solution, like I know the problem,
Right.
like why no one's like, but I think there is space for people to think critically, think deeply, and art can really do that, right? Because it can take that information and it can create these kind of like more questions, but also sort of like openings, like different entry points for, for people to sort of like you're saying, like with Genevieve's work, there's multiple ways you can look at it depending on what your knowledge is of her work or what your knowledge is of the issues are, or even the images she's depicting. So anybody could look at it and come away with different sort of levels of understanding, because there's no real like perfect answer to what you're supposed to get from looking at it, right? And I think, and whether it's looking at it or engaging with it, whatever the kind of work is calling you to do, it's just bringing you into a conversation to meet you where you're at. And that's, I think, really powerful. Yeah. Alicia, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, no, thank you. I sort of paused. This is something Amanda and I have sort of talked about before, and paused as, leaving space for Amanda as the artist, as the maker, to sort of weigh in a bit on that, because she has shared some really, beautiful ideas about this. Because I think absolutely, and this is a nice space to think about environmental humanities as well, right? How we approach environmentalism, sustainability through that interdisciplinary means, how knowledge is being shared, how it's being discussed, because these are very complex concepts that are difficult to grasp. Even those who are, in the field, Genevieve's work, thinking about deep time, that's a lot. That's complex. But as Amanda said, I think the arts are really interesting, not necessarily in that it overcomplicates the message, but it opens space for interpretation. And I think Amanda talked a bit about leaving space for, meaningful interpretation, which sometimes feels strange in other fields where it's sort of, this is the answer, or this is the result, this is the interpretation. So the idea that contemporary art, whether visual or not, it's allowing space for interpretation, reception, that I think adds to the work in some ways.
You just heard from Alicia French, professor of the history of art and visual culture in the Department of Visual Arts at Brock University, and Amanda White, an artist, scholar, and SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Sustainable Curating in the Department of Visual Art at Western University. Alicia and Amanda are co-editors of the recent volume Ecologies in Practice, Environmentally Engaged Arts in Canada, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the underwriter of this series. Join us next week for the final episode of this series when we discuss why there's a need for the art world to more intentionally focus on the environment and how art can inspire action. Moving forward, we look at the ways artists and art scholars can partner with other disciplines to expand environmental humanities scholarship. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy, who, for this series, contributed some of the interview questions. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.